My research proposal proposes a study where I would examine if and how social media impacts the motivation of athletes. The purpose is to see whether there is a correlation between intrinsically and extrinsically motivating social media posts on motivation. So this study refers to the cognitive evaluation theory and self-determination theory as a theoretical framework. The self-determination theory explains that self-determination is established when people are fulfilled in competence, connection, and autonomy. The cognitive evaluation theory explains the possible consequences of external rewards on intrinsic motivation. DET builds on SDT by explaining the effects of external consequences on intrinsic motivation. So there are two main types of motivation: intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation refers to being driven by internal satisfaction, whereas extrinsic motivation is thought of as being driven by external motivating factors and rewards. One contribution of the self-determination theory is the reevaluation of extrinsic motivation and how it can be thought of as a positive motivating factor for improved performance and well-being if associated with intrinsic values. So the purpose of this study is to evaluate the impact of intrinsic athletic Instagram posts versus extrinsic athletic Instagram posts on the motivation of athletes and how that affects performance and self-esteem. I argue that intrinsically focused social media posts will promote higher levels of motivation and performance self-esteem on college athletes, while extrinsic posts will decrease levels of motivation, performance, self-esteem. Another aspect of this study will examine the big 5 factors and how they correlate with intrinsically and extrinsically motivated individuals. I predict that the big 5 traits that will correlate with primarily intrinsic motivational athletes will be agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness, while big 5 factors that I predict will correlate with primarily extrinsic motivational quotes will be extroversion and neuroticism. And this study is important because in the world of college athletics, motivation is key to establishing a healthy physical and psychological environment. Knowing the triggers of an unhealthy psychological environment will allow coaches to adjust their coaching strategies and implement programs to foster development for the individual and the team as a whole. So for this study, the desired participants would be 100 D1 athletes, male and female, from the DMV area. And the measures would include a demographic survey, sports motivation scale to measure whether individuals are intrinsically or extrinsically motivated, a big 5 test, and an athlete self-report measure to analyze their performance self-esteem. And the procedure for this study would start with participants being given a demographic survey, and then participants would be randomized by numbers to take sports motivation scales and the big 5 personality test. Participants will randomly be assigned onto one of 3 teams, and the first team will be exposed to an intrinsically motivating Instagram post. The second team will be exposed to an extrinsically motivating post. The third team will be the control team, where they are not exposed to any social media posts. They will engage in one round of a game of flag football. After each team has played at least one round, then they're going to be asked to fill out the athlete self-report measure on MetroFit. So the proposed results that I expect to come out of this study: for the relationship between athletes' exposure to intrinsically motivating social media posts and a sports motivation style focused on intrinsic factors is expected to have a significant positive correlation. For extrinsic factors is expected to have a weak negative correlation. And the relationship between athletes' exposure to extrinsically motivating social media posts and sports motivation style focused on intrinsic factors is expected to have a significant negative correlation. Extrinsic factors is expected to have a significant positive correlation. And then these are some graphs just displaying a visual representation of the proposed results. To interpret these graphs, it's important to explain that for each graph, the y-axis represents a type of motivational style, either intrinsic or extrinsic, and the x-axis represents exposure to either intrinsic or extrinsic posts. Now, to continue the proposed results, Sports motivation scale and athlete self-report measure. The athletes motivated by intrinsic factors will feel better about themselves and their performance if exposed to intrinsic Instagram posts, while those exposed to extrinsic Instagram posts will feel less confident in their performance physically or mentally. And then the athletes motivated by extrinsic factors are expected to feel better about themselves and their performance is supposed to increase, while those exposed to intrinsic Instagram posts will most likely not feel confident in their performance physically or mentally. Athletes who scored higher for intrinsic motivation on the sports motivation scale are expected to score high in the traits of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. This is expected because all three of these traits incorporate self-determined behaviors and facets that are present in intrinsically motivated individuals, like empathy and altruism, and team-focused goals for agreeableness, stress control, and conscientiousness, and an attentiveness to internalized feelings for openness to experience. These are beneficial to the functionality of team sports in general. Athletes who scored high for extrinsic motivation are expected to score higher in the traits of neuroticism and extroversion. This is expected because emotional avoidance is common in neurotic people. And this could be a reason some athletes find motivation from external rather than internal factors because of the instability of their emotions. Extroverted people get their energy from their surroundings, so it's likely that an athlete who gets their motivation from external factors also gets their energy from other external factors. So what do the findings really mean? Intrinsically motivated athletes are less likely to be motivated or perform well when exposed to extrinsically motivating Instagram posts. Extrinsically motivated athletes are less likely to be motivated or perform well when exposed to intrinsically motivating Instagram posts. The type of message exhibited to athletes on social media posts has an impact dependent on their motivational style. So for future research, I believe that studying different coaching behaviors and styles and how that affects intrinsically motivated athletes' performances versus extrinsically motivated athletes' performance is important because coaching plays an important role in the physical and psychological health and motivation of athletes in general. And three key points that make this study applicable to athletes in real environments is that it is important for coaches to know how to interact with their athletes. And the key to team motivation and success is the proper development of each player. And personality influences motivational styles. And these are the references that I used to plan my research study. And these are the links to the type of forms and surveys that I would plan on including in this study, as well as the intrinsic and extrinsic Instagram posts that I would use.